Today we'll be discussing the article "The Confederacy Was a Con Job on Whites and Still Is" by Frank Hyman. I lived 55 years in the South, and I grew up liking the Confederate flag. I haven't flown one for many decades, but for a reason that might surprise you. I know the South well. We lived wherever the Marine Corps stationed my father, Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas. As a child, my favorite uncle wasn't in the military, but he did pack a .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun in his trunk. He was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Despite my role models, as a kid, I was an inept racist. I got in trouble once in the first grade for calling a classmate the N-word. But he was Hispanic. As I grew up and acquired the strange sensation called empathy, strange for boys anyway, I learned that for black folks, the flutter of that flag felt like a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And for the most prideful flag wavers, clearly that response was the point. I mean, come on, it's a battle flag. What the flag symbolizes for blacks is enough reason to take it down. But there's also another reason that white Southerners shouldn't fly it, or sport it on our state-issued license plates, as some here in North Carolina. The Confederacy, and the slavery that spawned it, was also one big con job on Southern white working class. A con job funded by some of the antebellum one-percenters that continues today in a similar form. You don't have to be an economist to see that forcing blacks, a third of the South's laborers, to work without pay drove down wages for everyone else, and not just in agriculture. A quarter of enslaved blacks worked in the construction, manufacturing, and lumbering trades, cutting wages even for skilled white workers. Thanks to the profitability of this no-wage, low-wage combination, a majority of American one-percenters were Southerners. Slavery made Southern states the richest in the country. The South was richer than any other country except England. But that vast wealth was invisible outside the plantation ballrooms. With low wages and fewer schools, Southern whites suffered a much lower land ownership rate and a far lower literacy rate than Northern whites. My ancestor, Canna Hyman, and his two sons did own land and fought under that flag. A note from our family history says, "Someone came for them while they were plowing one day. They put their horses up, and all three went away to the war, and only one son, William, came back." Like Cana, most Southerners didn't own slaves, but they were persuaded to risk their lives and limbs for the right of a few to get rich as Croesus from slavery. For their sacrifices and their votes, they earned two things before and after the Civil War. First, a very skinny slice of the immense Southern pie, and second, the thing that made those slim rations palatable then and now, the shallow satisfaction of knowing that blacks had no slice at all. They managed this con job partly with a propaganda technique that will be familiar to modern Americans, but hasn't received the coverage it deserves in our sexacentennial celebrations. Starting in the 1840s, wealthy Southerners supported more than 30 regional pro-slavery magazines, many pamphlets, newspapers, and novels that falsely touted slave ownership as having benefits that would, in today's lingo, trickle down to benefit non-slave owning whites and even blacks. The flip side of the coin of this old is new trickle-down propaganda is the mistaken notion that any gain by blacks in wages, schools, or health care comes at the expense of the white working class. Today's version of this con job no longer supports slavery, but still works in the South and thrives in pro-trickle-down think tanks, magazines, newspapers, talk radio, and TV news shows such as the Cato Foundation, Reason Magazine, Rush Limbaugh, and Fox News. These sources are underwritten by pro-trickle-down one-percenters like the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch. For example, a map of states that didn't expand Medicaid, which would actually be a boon mostly to poor whites, resembles a map of the old Confederacy with a few other poor rural states thrown in. Another indication that this divisive propaganda works on Southern whites came in 2012. Romney and Obama evenly split the white working class in the West, Midwest, and Northeast. But in the South, we went 2-1 for Romney. Lowering the flag because of the harm done to blacks is the right thing to do. We also need to lower it because it symbolizes material harm the ideology of the Confederacy did to Southern whites that lasts even to this day. One can love the South without flying the battle flag, but it won't help to get rid of an old symbol if we can't also rid ourselves of the self-destructive beliefs that go with it. Only by shedding those two will Southern whites finally catch up with the rest of the country in wages, health, and education. I like that article very much. It's not a new thing, but I think it hits at a point that causes us to understand a little better what the background is behind the, what might roughly be called the Trumpers. That there was this sense that there was a righteous purpose in the Confederacy, and that they were, there was something good they were seeking out. And Dustin and I were just talking about some of the tenets of a moral philosophy that underpin that. Dustin, why don't you get back into that if you don't mind? You were talking about how the difference between liberals and conservatives is what sort of bias they present. I guess that's a fair way of saying it.
Yeah, there was a great thing from John Haidt about the moral pathways, and of course this is still social science. It's still being formed, but it was a great way to kind of look at things. There were 5 moral pathways that he had discovered: was authority, purity, loyalty, equity, and justice. And the left, you can tell by somebody on the left, and we all have these, we're born with these innate understanding.
But as my son Max grows up in a liberal college town, how is this first draft going to get revised? And how will it end up being different from a kid born 60 miles south of us in Lynchburg, Virginia? To think about cultural variation, let's try a different metaphor. If there really are 5 systems at work in the mind, 5 sources of intuitions and emotions, then we can think of the moral mind as being like one of those audio equalizers that has 5 channels where you can set it to a different setting on every channel. And my colleagues Brian Nozick and Jesse Graham and I made a questionnaire, which we put up on the web at www.yourmorals.org. And so far, 30,000 people have taken this questionnaire, and you can too. Here are the results. Here are the results from about 23,000 American citizens. On the left, I've plotted the scores for liberals. On the right, those for conservatives. In the middle, the moderates. The blue line shows you people's responses on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness. But look at the other 3 lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality. I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a 2-channel or 2-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a 5-foundation or 5-channel.
We can't question the police because there's a reason for them to kind of, there's a reason for this, and it's law and order and this kind of thing. And once you really try to look at it from that perspective, it kind of makes a little sense. But on the other side, you might say, well, the authority is the Constitution, and you're thinking of it wrong. But we on the left don't talk about the police in terms of authority. we talk about it in terms of equity and justice, and more so justice. So it's the idea of, and I know I rolled through that, but it's the idea of, can you frame your argument from another person's moral perspective when you don't value that moral as highly as they do? Tricky business.
Yeah. We've tended to focus on the Confederacy and the Civil War in terms of strictly North and South. And even in Kentucky, we kind of like to distinguish ourselves as a border state, and that a lot of people fancy that. But the division at the time of the Civil War wasn't, strictly speaking, North and South. I mean, slavery was legal in some parts and illegal in other parts. But in terms of the attitude, and Dustin, to your point about your moral outlook and whether you're more inclined to authority or liberty and justice, those were all over the map as well. I mean, Frederick Douglass was the one who was promoting slavery. He was debating in your state of Illinois, and there were, the slaves were being sold in New York, and they didn't have slaves; they just sold them. So it wasn't a clear geographical division. So I guess my question is it fair to point to the South and say, you're the guilty ones, and we're gonna continue to punish you for all of this racism that occurs, when that's not universally so.
The way you put that is people should by now hopefully see the trouble in that when you go after one identity group. There's all sorts of problems with that. But you also can't ignore, it's a way when they get into intersectionality and structural racism, how that plays out, and how Jim Crow laws are a little either more prevalent or easier to pass in the South than the North. They were everywhere. Yeah. But this comes back to the I love how Paul, you said it's whether you have a gun or not. Like, this isn't geographical. This is the weird existential place we're in now, where it's becoming less about geography and race, and even less about wealth, in my opinion. It's, the poors don't think of themselves as one group. We're all the poors, by the way. It's this ideological thing. And since, the more Black Republicans we get, it's going to be harder to look at all these traditional easy distinguishers, and it's more about if you have a gun or not, if you have a truck or not. The urban rural divide, I think, was a very strong thing, but that's fading too, because America has pretty much become a suburb. Their suburbs outweigh urban and rural areas. So how do we do the positive and negative things about group identity when it's harder to tell what a group is?
Well, one of the ways we do that is with basketball and football sports. When they don't, it is, and people, I think there was somebody got shot up last night after the basketball game was over and got beaten up something. So it's fairly serious. People take those things as well. So that's another one of those markers that you get. The Texas is more even more problematic simply because of its identities, the strong identities that exist in those different places. Mm-hmm. And they, if you're in Dallas and Oklahoma comes to play, you better be sure that you got somebody to be sober enough to drive you home, because you're gonna be so wasted you won't be able to walk. And I mean, a lot of that kind of behavior. So the morality of that, there's nothing wrong with getting drunk on Texas OU weekend. I mean, that's what everybody does, right? That's of course the argument. But the poors, you get into that, and we're going to launch into Michael's favorite thing, which is caste.
Yeah.
And I read the first chapter of that. Thought, well, this is going to be some heavy reading, but nonetheless,
people of revolution, man.
Man, it is, it's like, there it is. And because I keep thinking about, okay, who else, what's our thing that we can talk about that reflects the same sort of thing, which is only really the India situation. The caste, and then the caste there are like ancient. 1,000 years. I mean, they've been that way. The Germans tried it; they just didn't succeed at it with Hitler. So,
Well, the way this is, you're talking about the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and what Wilkerson says is that caste is the bone structure, race is the skin, and that caste is something that lies beneath the surface that's there, constantly. And this notion, and it's always difficult to put oneself back into the kind of the perspective, the point of view of someone before the Civil War. But, we have to appreciate that the heritage in the South came from a royal system in England. I mean, these were folks who would have been the landed gentry in England, and they found this great opportunity in the American South when the textile industry in England switched from wool to cotton, and the cotton industry exploded. This was a way to get rich quick. So the background of people in the top level in the South was really, it had no consciousness of the sort of, the things we may take for granted in terms of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, government of the people, all that kind of stuff. That really wasn't, I don't think they ever really accepted that. Even, they joined in the United States because they wanted to protect themselves from being taken over by the English people who would have come and taken it from them as well. But they didn't really buy into the notion of those two realms that you were discussing earlier, Dustin, that, the division seems to be constantly between the rights of the people and divine right of kings. I was struck by that in something that you had said.
Well, I was going to ask about caste of like, and I probably have this wrong, but my bias is caste, like in India specifically, it's a very rigid thing, and it's an acceptance of what you're capable of, or what your life is going to be like, that kind of, like, you accept the ceiling, basically, right. Is how caste gets reinforced. And one, is that true? And two, in America, does that run into problems? Because even though we do have a caste system, we just don't recognize it, because we don't recognize us. We don't recognize a ceiling.
We don't talk about it. I think we do recognize it. Ironically, even
maybe we don't, because we're white men.
Well, but even Donald Trump and some of the writings about him, when he was never really accepted into the upper circles in Manhattan. He was always that rube for Mountain Queens, and he never made it into that. I think that explains a lot about his character as well. He was going to show them because, he could fake his way into making a lot of money. And he always thought, well, if I have more money, then I'm naturally, part of the upper group. And he never was. He never became part of that upper echelon of sophisticated society in Manhattan because of the caste system. It wasn't because of money, and it wasn't because of race. It was because of a lot of things in background, education, intelligence, cultural affinity, all of those things that comprise this caste system. So we sort of recognize, I'll just speak for myself, that I would recognize that if I came into a group of professors from Harvard and Yale, and maybe throw in CEOs of some major companies and so forth, I feel the inferiority of caste in that. Not that I probably am as bright or informed as any of them, but I do feel a sense of, gee, I really don't belong here. This is not my rightful place.
I see that in the news, and I keep bringing this up of like, this is the self-selection in news. Like, somebody like me won't get a job on MSNBC, or if I did, it would be for about 10 minutes. Like the people, when you listen to the people talk about the news, especially, and this is, again, you're going to get a bias of the people who got kicked out of the news. The people who are still in it think it's great. But the people who got kicked out will tell you, these are all self-selected Ivy League, upper class, white, privileged type people. Like, they don't even recognize that they're in a group.
Right. Right. They're what Spiro Agnew used to call the effete intellectuals.
Yeah, and they're that. They're
Mattering nabobs of negativism. Yeah.
Once you start researching the college degrees of the newsroom personnel, you'll find a disturbing trend that the only and therefore only credible perspective is that of an upper class Ivy League graduate.
Right.
It's, they're like, 1% of the population.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that has a lot of impact. Recently we've had this more and more a discussion about the value of college education. Well, in terms of financial value, it's a ripoff. What you put into it is not going to be overcome by what you get out of it, with some exceptions. I mean, if you're going to medicine or so forth. But this idea that you can elevate yourself through those with whom you associate, that is germane to the caste system, whereas the negative part of it, of looking down on someone else because of a condition they can't control, like race, is a different thing. It's not exactly the same sort of thing. The assumption in caste is that somehow you're more worthy because of something you or perhaps your family has earned that entitles you to something. It's not because of your color or height or weight or any of those things that you don't control, but it's why if I'm, and I think it fits very nicely into some Protestant theologies, where if you're doing well, if you're successful, it must be because God loves you. If you're poor and destitute, you must have been an evil person somehow, or an immoral person.
Well, the other thing about that was always what is said about going to college, at least in the parts of the world that I ran in, was that, it's who you meet.
Yeah.
When you're there that matters more than anything else, which is connecting up to the elite and the class system. Not that they want to be associated with you, but that's another question.
Yeah, that is. I mean, that's really the traditional thing. It wasn't until after World War II that people like us would go to college. I mean, it wasn't even thought. My older brothers never even gave a thought. It wasn't something that was in their horizon whatsoever. And I found it interesting when Bill Clinton was running for president, and even through his presidency, that was the thing that made people in the the conservative Republicans really dislike him, and that was because he got there on merit. He grew up dirt poor in Arkansas, but he became a Fulbright scholar, and he did go to Oxford. He did do a lot of things to prove himself educationally, and they hate it. They hate Obama for the same reason. I mean, there are a lot of reasons they hated Obama, but one of those reasons was he proved that system wrong, that anybody could achieve that bright people, intellectual people could come from any strata in society. It wasn't something that belonged just to the upper caste. And they hate that as much as white, Confederate flag wavers hate to see immigrants. It's like I feel like something's unfair. I have a right to something, and these other people don't have a right to it.
That's right.
And putting someone down, as in the case of slavery, is just as self-fulfilling somehow as raising your own stature. So I don't have to work at improving myself. All I have to do is make sure. It's like the old joke of the guy running from the bear. And the fellow says, well, I don't think we can outrun him. He says, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. So,
yep, that is a joke. Well, that's the whole business about mobility is one that the elite has always had problems with. This is not a new thing. They've been, they've generally found it amenable to bring somebody along and put in, if they have an attitude that the riches don't like, then they can stick them off someplace where it won't cause any trouble.
Yeah.
But what the problem that the wealthy have and the elite in America was that the founding fathers who had read all those outrageous philosophy books talking about everybody being all the same, screwed everything up for them.
Right. And
so they've been spending most of this, and those were the folks in the South in particular, and so, or at least close to the South. I mean, Washington was living right in the border there, but they read that same stuff, and that was the whole business about, oh, look at this wonderful idea. And as we know from now, they didn't even come close. But that attitude was still in the wealthy population. They're still there for them to do that, and should be what they do, and then that's caused them problems ever since.
I can see that attitude in academia, especially, that it's idealism, and I'll skip to the end. It's, a true communalist and someone not interested in seeking power doesn't, so you don't really see them. The idealist who will dive into the power systems either will do it for selfish interest and not be aware, or be aware. The person who just wants to give all their stuff to the poor will not be rich. The person who wants to emphasize communal power won't have enough power to overpower someone to get the conversation about power.
The Koch brothers, you got to be out there working and making it, and that's how you're a valuable person, is because you made a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Period. And that's all. And the only thing that the government's for, right, is the military and guard the banks. The legislatures to put people in prison if they mess with the banks, and the banks to take care of the money of the rich people.
Right.
Or the parts.
Now this is the same on the left. You hear a lot of this of, do you reform the Democratic Party or not? And I know people are going to hold on to that forever. But it's like, no, if a system's based on capital and you want one based on community, you got to build your own infrastructure. Like this idea of like people chafing at building your own infrastructure. I'm like, well, now we can. Like, we can have our own news programs. We can have our own internet. We can have our own banks. We can have our own everything. Everything you wanted, aside from microchips and nuclear weapons, your community can build. And I think COVID, I hope it provided some examples to people of like, how do you become communally self-sufficient?
Mm-hmm.
But
I hope so too. And maybe that's a good point to wrap up on, because I want to tell both of you I really enjoyed these conversations, and it's been I guess there's a satisfaction in communicating about these issues rather than being communicated to on these issues. It's good to share ideas, and so thank you for today.